Good morning, good
morning.
afternoon, and good evening. Thank you for joining us around the world. We are here in Yamaha's headquarters in the United Kingdom. Thanks for joining our live webinar number 3. My name's Andy Cooper.
And my name's Carl Christmas.
And behind the scenes running the video and the Zoom webinar for us, we have James Wood and Ascot Kitagawa. So, today we are looking at programming Yamaha remote controls. There's a variety of controllers available, aren't there, Carl,
Yep.
for all the equipment we have around us and more. So we've got a lot to learn. But hey, for everyone who's in the Northern Hemisphere, I hope you've had good summer holidays. Where have you been, Carl?
I had my holiday a long time ago, but I've actually just got back from the US, where I had a really fascinating trip. I went to Texas, Washington State, Florida, and Philadelphia, where I visited lots of installations and spoke to a number of different people. Fascinating stuff. Lots of this type of equipment and speakers, and yeah, great time. And I actually went to a brewery bar, which they forced me to test all the different beers, unfortunately, but I survived.
Horrendous.
I survived. No, it was a
Actually, I'm quite jealous.
Yeah, you will be.
There'll be some video footage coming soon of that.
Yes, they will be. Yeah, yeah.
Keep a lookout.
Before we drunk the beer. Yeah.
Okay. So today's webinar, we are using the Zoom app. If you are joining us with a tablet, may I suggest to you that if you're watching like that, it might crop off the edges. So you could try in portrait mode like that. That might help you to see everything. The aspect ratio of our broadcast is 16:9. If you're looking on a computer, then you can drag the edges of your Zoom window to try and see everything, just so you don't miss out little bits on the edges of our videos and PowerPoint slides.
Yeah, and again, thank you for joining us today. If you want to catch up with the things that we're talking about today, or if you want to tell a colleague or a friend about the content that you see today, these will, of course, like our other webinars, be hosted on our global YouTube channel. Sometime in the next week or so, it'll be put up there.
Yeah, so either look for the Yamaha Global YouTube channel, or you can search with the hashtag Audioversity. You'll find our previous 2 webinars there, and this one will be there soon. But of course, for you lucky people able to join us live, you can type in some live questions and we'll try and answer as many as we can during the next 50 or 60 minutes. So please use the Q&A section in the Zoom app. We won't be monitoring the chat section during the webinar, but we will be looking closely at the Q&A. So please use that as we progress through this broadcast.
And if we don't manage to answer all the questions because we run out of time, we will still keep the typing section of the Zoom open after the video has finished. And so we'll try to answer your questions afterwards, or if we still can't do that, we'll email you the answers later on.
Indeed, yeah. So Carl,
Yes.
give us a quick run through what we're doing these next few minutes.
Okay, well, the title of this webinar is called Keep Yourself, or Control Yourself. That was it. I forgot what I called it. It's all about remote control, and whether you are in a hospitality venue, whether you are in a conference center, whether you are in a house of worship, whether you're a non-skilled operator or you're a sound engineer, control of your system, control of what is going on around you is the most important thing. And particularly for non-skilled operators, simple, logical control of your audio system is most important. So what I'm trying to do is to take you through the existing range of various different controllers that we already do, a little bit of technical background on those, but then as our remote control options have advanced, I want to introduce you to the very latest, which is ProVisionaire Control, which is a fantastic new piece of software. So I'm going to introduce you to ProVisionaire Control, and then towards the end we'll have a training session where we will see how to start from scratch and build a ProVisionaire Control system for your customer.
Brilliant. I'm really looking forward to that. I know I am going to learn a lot, so I'm sure you guys also will do. So I think we're going to start off with a little video, yes?
Yep.
Which you pre-recorded.
Yep.
So we have an overview of all the available remote control options.
Let's have a look at that. If you've already used or programmed on Yamaha's MTX or MRX processors, then you may already be familiar with the DCP wall panels or digital control panels. These feature a combination of buttons and rotary encoders or knobs, and parameters from the MTX and MRX can be assigned to these buttons and rotary encoders. They can include parameters such as volume control, source select, amplifier standby, or even total room reconfiguration. They can be mounted to the wall using standard EU or US backboxes, and they're discrete and they're simple to use for the end user. Parameters are assigned to the DCP panels using MTX MRX editor software, and the DCPs can be used in conjunction with wireless DCP, ProVisionaire Touch and ProVisionaire Control applications that we'll look at in more detail later on. Up to 8 units of DCP can be connected to a single MTX or MRX system. Standard connection is in series using the dedicated DCP socket on the back of the MTX or MRXs. But it's worth noting that every time you add an additional DCP to the processor, the distance from the farthest DCP reduces. So as we see in this diagram, 1 unit of DCP can be up to 1,000 meters away from the processor. However, if you have 3 DCP panels, then the maximum distance from the farthest can be no more than 550 meters. Now, this type of series connection may suit the design of the building that you're working on. However, sometimes you want to be able to connect in a star configuration instead of a series connection. So, Yamaha has introduced the DCH8 or Digital Controller Hub. This allows for a combination of star and series connections. The DCH8 is passive, so no power is required, and it uses standard Cat5e cabling. Looking at the distances of DCPs connected either in series or using the DCH8, we can see on the top line, again, that every time you add an additional DCP, the distance from the farthest reduces. So as we see here, if you've got 3 DCPs connected, the farthest unit can be no more than 550 meters away from the processor. However, the distance from each port when it's connected using the DCH8 is fixed at 200 meters. Let's look at that in more detail. Here we see a standard series connection, and we have 3 units of DCP, and as we know, the farthest can be no more than 550 meters away. In this case, it's 440 meters away, so that's absolutely fine. If we look at the DCH8, we see that 3 ports are connected, and the maximum distance from each of the farthest DCP panels is no more than 200 meters. Therefore, this system will work fine. As an alternative to the DCP panels, there is an app called Wireless DCP. This is a free app and it's available on the iTunes Store or Google Play, and it's compatible with iOS or Android devices. It provides exactly the same type of control as the DCP panels and is configured in the same way as the DCPs using MTX or MRX editor. It uses standard wireless access points, and up to 8 units of wireless DCP can be connected to the MTX and MRX processors. For more advanced hardware control, there is also the option of the MCP1. This features a high-quality material finish and can also include many different languages on the screen. It can control up to 36 parameters simultaneously. One of the key differences between the DCP and the MCP1 is the control protocol can be transmitted over fiber optics, which means the maximum distance from the MCP1 to the processors can be far, far greater. Up to 16 MCP1s can be connected to one MTX MRX system. As I mentioned before, these hardware controllers can be used in conjunction with a range of different software applications that Yamaha provide, one of which is ProVisionaire Touch. ProVisionaire Touch is a free iPad app which is completely customizable, perfect for bespoke remote control solutions. ProVisionaire Touch is programmed on the iPad. You can start off with one of the templates, or you can make a completely bespoke design. There's a large range of customizable buttons or switches that we call widgets, and you can also include customizable graphics and customized labels. All of these different buttons and switches and faders can be assigned to individual parameters on an MTX MRX, making it a far more sophisticated design tool for your customers. It's the perfect tool for education, hospitality, or corporate applications or houses of worship, where the control can be matched with the client's identity or brand. ProVisionaire Touch can not only control Yamaha's MTX MRX systems, it can also control a range of Yamaha digital mixers, as well as MusicCast AV devices and Yamaha's range of Disclavia N-Spire pianos. The controller is delivered to the customer using a separate app called ProVisionaire Kiosk. This app allows for control only, so the customer cannot upset or spoil the design that you've made. And as I mentioned before, this ProVisionaire software can also be used in conjunction with the wireless DCP, the DCP and the MCP hardware controls to simultaneously control MTX or MRX systems. Now in this webinar, we're not going to show you details of how to program DCP, ProVisionaire Touch or wireless DCP and MCP1, but if you go to our website, you'll see a self-training tab. And on this self-training tab, there are a whole host of videos that can take you through step by step how to program these various devices. That was an overview of what's currently available, including the hardware, the wireless DCP on the phone, and the ProVisionaire Touch that you heard me mention. ProVisionaire Touch is the app which is programmed and operated on an iPad. But recently, Yamaha has launched a new app called ProVisionaire Control. And this is, I wouldn't say more advanced, but it has more control of different products and it has a much more flexible way of programming it. So I want to introduce you now to ProVisionaire Control and show you how it is different from the iPad app ProVisionaire Touch. So the next video gives you an overview of those.
Right, and while this is playing, don't forget questions and answers. Use the Q&A section of the Zoom app to send us any questions, and we shall do our very best to answer them for you a little bit later.
And not the chat bit of the...
Not the chat, but the Q&A section.
Right.
Thanks. So let's learn a bit then about the new ProVisionaire Control.
Great. James. Okay, so let's start off by looking at an overview of the ProVisionaire Control software and its younger brother, ProVisionaire Control Kiosk. This is an overview of ProVisionaire Control and ProVisionaire Control Kiosk softwares. ProVisionaire Control is a customizable control software for Yamaha PA systems. And, as we've already heard, it's programmed and can be used on Windows PCs and tablets. In this presentation, we'll look at what ProVisionaire Control is, what it can control, and how it's different from ProVisionaire Touch. ProVisionaire Control and ProVisionaire Kiosk is a custom controller for Yamaha PA systems. Like ProVisionaire Touch, it's a free application. Yes, I did say free. Back to the video. And as we know, it's programmed using Microsoft Windows. It uses what we call widgets, such as faders and switches, on a screen to design an original controller. And it's dedicated to control and monitor the system required for an installation project. And a wide range of Yamaha PA equipment can be controlled, such as processors, amplifiers and mixers. In terms of the difference between ProVisionaire Control and ProVisionaire Touch, ProVisionaire Control is an application for controlling and monitoring the whole Yamaha audio system, whereas ProVisionaire Touch is specifically designed just for controlling installed equipment. In terms of OS, obviously, ProVisionaire Control uses Windows and ProVisionaire Touch uses iOS. And the target applications for ProVisionaire Control are convention centers, hotels, and theme parks, or larger installations where you may be using fixed audio and movable live sound equipment. And with ProVisionaire Touch, aimed at more hospitality markets such as restaurants, hotels, town halls, and churches, etc. They can both control products, but only ProVisionaire Control is able to monitor products. And both have the ability to set up security levels. In terms of ProVisionaire Control versus ProVisionaire Control Kiosk, Control is aimed at the contractor, and the Kiosk is aimed at the facility manager or facility staff. You can only design using ProVisionaire Control software. You can control and monitor on both of them, particularly using the test run feature, which I'll cover later on, and you can only set up the security levels on ProVisionaire Control software. In terms of what these products are able to control, they do differ slightly from controller to controller. ProVisionaire Touch, as of version 3, can control our MTX MRX processors, a range of CL, QL, TF digital mixers, XMV amplifiers, Nexos NX amps, a variety of I/O units including Rio D2s and TOs, the VXL1P Power over Ethernet column speakers, a range of MusicCast devices from our AV department, and a range of Disclavier Inspire pianos. In terms of ProVisionaire Control version 3, it can control at the moment slightly fewer products, including the MTX MRX processors, the same range of CL/QL TF mixers, the XMV amplifiers, the NX amps from Nexo, but a slightly smaller range of the I/O units, so it cannot control the Rio D2s, and it will also control the VXL1P Power over Ethernet column speakers. At the moment, it doesn't control AV or Disclavier, but the SD function playback is available on the MTX and MRX. As we'll see later, version 3.5 has come out for ProVisionaire Control, and that has expanded the range of products that we can control using this software. In terms of the workflow, it's very straightforward. The contractor designs on ProVisionaire Control, and then he exports a file which can then be uploaded onto a ProVisionaire kiosk software which is owned and run by the facility manager. This prevents customers from breaking the controller, and it also protects the design knowledge of the contractor. As of version 3, designs made in a ProVisionaire Control software can now be exported both to a Windows tablet and to a ProVisionaire Touch kiosk file to be used on an iOS iPad. This is great news for those of you who have previously been designing ProVisionaire Touch kiosk files, because hopefully this will speed up the process and make it more flexible. In terms of ProVisionaire Kiosk, facility managers and staff can use the ProVisionaire Kiosk to load the file that's been exported by the contractor. The controller can then be used in two different modes. It can be used in full screen or in window mode so that you can access different applications. A word of warning, however, if your customer is going to use it in full screen mode, make sure to include a window closing button in your design, because unlike the iPad, where you've got the button to close the screen, you don't in a Windows tablet, so you need to give the customer some way of closing the window. ProVisionaire Control can handle a huge number of parameters. One project alone can handle up to 20 controllers. A controller may be something that controls a specific device. Each controller can have up to 50 pages of different levels of control, and each page can have up to 1024 widgets, such as faders and buttons, etc. And a maximum of 30,000 widgets can be applied per controller. So that gives you a total of 600,000 parameters that you can control in one project. I wouldn't want to program 600,000 parameters, and I don't suppose there are many installations that would require that many, but it can be done. Widgets such as sliders, buttons, photos, etc. can be placed on the design page. Their sizes and colors, as well as many other properties, can be customized, and we'll look at how to do that in detail in the following training video that I'll show you. To place these widgets, there are 3 different methods. You can go to the list of widgets on the left of the screen and simply drag and drop them onto the screen. However, if you do that, they won't have any specific parameter associated with them, so you'll have to apply the parameter to that widget later on. A quicker way to do it is if you already have a device list set up in your ProVisionaire Control software, you can go to a specific device, find that parameter you want to control, and drag and drop that onto the screen. For example, an MTX fader on channel number 1 can be dragged on to the screen, and that parameter will automatically be associated when you go online with that product. And great news for those of you who are designing for MRX7D. You can drag and drop the specific parameters from MRX Designer directly onto the screen. If you've used ProVisionaire Touch, you'll know you need to export an RCSL file in order to associate parameters from MRX7. This really speeds up designing controllers for MRX7Ds. And finally, one of my favorite parts of ProVisionaire Control is the Run Controller function. This allows you, as you're going along, to check your design and functionality, either on the PC or on the iPad. So if you're running on the PC, you can open up a virtual copy of your controller, test it, make sure it looks good. Or if you're using an iPad, you can wirelessly transmit a flash version or a temporary version to your iPad, check it's working, check that it looks good, and then continue with your programming. I'll show you more about that in the programming guide in the next section of this webinar.
Thanks, Carl. Nice.
Well,
yeah. Good things to learn.
So just to clarify, ProVisionaire Touch is programmed and operated on an iPad. and it won't work on a Windows tablet. It's only for the iPad. But ProVisionaire Control, you make it, design it on your PC, and then you can export it and use it on a Windows tablet, or at the same time, you can also send it to a ProVisionaire Touch kiosk software and operate it from your iPad. So you have two different choices. Now, how to program those and the differences between them will follow in the programming training video later on.
Right, right. So just to clarify, there's ProVisionaire Control
Yep.
for a Windows computer to make a design.
Yep.
And there's ProVisionaire Control Kiosk,
Yep.
which is just for controlling the...
It's the end user.
Yeah. It's not editable at all, is it?
No.
It's fixed. So that's for the operator,
Yep.
and that can run on a Windows computer, a Windows tablet, or an Apple tablet.
Yes, if you're using ProVisionaire Touch kiosk. So you have two different directions you can send it from the PC, one to ProVisionaire Control kiosk for using a Windows tablet, or to ProVisionaire Touch kiosk on an iPad.
On the iPad.
And I cover that in quite a lot of detail in the training video.
I'm glad about that. Good. We are all learning. So ProVisionaire Touch and ProVisionaire Control, they both have a little difference between what products they can actually control.
Yeah, you
don't
saw
they?
on that video. They've been developed at slightly different times. So the range of products is slightly different, as is the type of widgets and some of the control you can do on the different softwares. But the ultimate aim is to bring the two up to the same level of control. Right. But as you'll see in the next video, and we touched on there, the two different softwares are targeted at different end users. So one is targeted more at hospitality, so it gives you the opportunity to control the MusicCast AV devices, as well as the Piano Inspire, piano disclaviers. So if you can imagine that could be used to control background music, piano music, AV devices in a hotel lobby, for example.
Yeah.
Whereas ProVisionaire Control is targeted more at maybe more sophisticated systems in conference center, for example, or a house of worship that has visiting artists and presenters. So it includes more control over things like mixing consoles, speakers, etc. Although, as I said, in time, the level of control and the number of products that you can control should hopefully match at the end of it.
Yeah. Both apps include the kind of core products that we have surrounding us today, basically. Exactly. The consoles and the matrix processors. Yeah,
precisely.
All right. Well, I think we ought to perhaps move on and take a look at your programming guide then.
Yes.
Program ProVisionaire Control.
This covers, this covers the basics and should hopefully get you started. It's a really fascinating, it's a really useful and flexible tool, ProVisionaire Control. So it's worth checking out some of the details and learning more about it.
Okay, let's go back into classroom mode. But remember, Q&A on the app. Fire in your questions. We'll have enough time at the end to answer some of them. Okay, let's all do some learning together.
Welcome to the programming section for the ProVisionaire Control webinar. There's a lot of information to get through, and I won't have enough time to go through everything, but my idea is to give you enough to get you started. Now, you can program offline, so you don't have to have devices connected to your PC, but I would recommend, if you can, have the devices you're programming for connected to the PC, because it will be much faster and you'll be able to test as you go along. Now, you can connect to the PC wirelessly or wired with your network, and if you're using fixed or auto DHCP, that's your choice. If you're using fixed IP addresses, then I would recommend the PC set to the usual 192.168.0.253. But in this case, I'm using an Apple Airport Express to connect up my devices using auto DHCP. So in MTX Editor, I've got an MTX5D, an MRX7D, and an XMV amplifier connected to the network, and I've also got a CL1 and a DZR speaker. In the CL1, we need to make sure in the network settings that we have the IP address set to the same range, as we also need to do with the DZR speaker. And we can see here in the MTX editor, if we go to the device information, the IP addresses are also in the same range as the CL and the DZR. Now we're ready to start programming on ProVisionaire Control. So, we find the ProVisionaire Control software and open it. Next, we have the chance to either load a pre-existing file, or in this case what we'll do is we'll start a new file with this icon in the top left-hand corner. It asks us to pick the network connection, which in this case is my dongle connected to my network here with the same IP address range. So I select that and OK. And here's where we have to choose the type and the aspect ratio of the controller that we're going to program for. And this is the most important section you need to think about when you're starting off. You need to know from the outset what type of tablet your customer is going to use. Because once you've programmed for the tablet in a certain size or aspect ratio, you cannot change it and go back. So it's really important so you know the type and the aspect ratio and size of the tablet your customer is going to use. So that's a discussion you need to have with your customer before you start programming for it. You have the choice of starting in Windows mode or in ProVisionaire Touch Kiosk iOS mode. Again, once you've chosen to go down this route, because the parameters are slightly different, you cannot go back and swap it over to a different format. So you really need to know from the outset what type you're going to use. I'm going to start working in standard Windows mode. I can pick my aspect ratio here, which I'll choose 16:9, and I can choose the screen size, which happens to match my PC here. And I click Next. At this point, we can add processors that we're going to control, unless you've already got them connected. And if we look down in the left-hand side of the screen, you can see that there's already a list of the devices that we've connected in our network. So we don't need to add any devices in this section right now, although we could. And the choice would be from the various power amplifiers, I/O interfaces, digital mixers, audio processors, powered speakers, or the video switchers. So I'm going to close that and we'll start looking at the screen. So here we have the main programming window of ProVisionaire Control. In the middle is the work area where we'll be placing the widgets and making our design. And it's worth noting that in the top right, here we can zoom in, zoom out, or fit to screen. That's a very useful area to know about. And on the left-hand side, this is where we can add or delete or rename all our different pages and controllers. Below that is the list of devices that we've got connected to our network. At the moment, you can see there's a question mark over all of the devices. So we right-click and add each of them, and that will bring them into our design so that we can take the parameters from each device. Next to it is another tab called Widgets. Now, what's a widget? A widget is the name that Yamaha has given to anything such as a fader, a button, a dial, a meter that can be dragged into the work area as part of your design. So when I refer to widgets from now on, that's what I'm referring to. Any of these boxes can be closed down to make your workspace more manageable, or opened up using the View section here. Along the top, we have the options to redo or undo and repeat functions we've done on the screen, as well as arrange them in various ways around the screen or group different widgets together so that we can edit them simultaneously. So, when we talk about widgets, which are going to be controlling parameters for all of these devices, there are three ways we can put them onto the screen. You can take a widget straight from the list here, such as a slider or fader, and you can just simply drag it onto the screen like so. We can zoom in to see it slightly larger. Now, the problem with that, just like in ProVisionaire Touch, you see that there's no parameter associated with it, with this icon here. On the right-hand side of the screen is the Properties section. This will list all the properties, such as the parameters, the color, the scale, etc., that relate to each widget that you put onto the screen in the work area. You can build up your design by simply choosing your widget, clicking on it, dragging and dropping it onto the screen. Now, that hasn't got a parameter for a device associated with it. So later on, you will need to associate a parameter from whichever device you want to control to, in this case, to this fader. The faster way to do it, if I delete that, is to go to our devices and then look at the drop-down menu for each device. This will give us all the parameters for the different devices that we can control using the widgets. For example, if I choose input channel, level, drag it over, drop it onto the screen, it asks me how many faders or how many channels I want to control. I can do more than one at once, so I could choose 4 channels at once, hit OK, and all 4 faders will be dropped on. Now, if I click on one of these faders or sliders on the screen, on the right hand side are the properties associated with it, such as the model, the parameter, as well as the properties concerned with position and appearance, and I can change its appearance quite dramatically. I can do it individually, such as moving it and scaling it on the screen, or, let's undo that, I can select all these sliders together, and with the group function I can then change all the parameters for those faders simultaneously. Let me show you how to do that. Once I've done that, I can then fit it to screen so I know what it looks like in my total design. And up here is the run function. This will create a virtual ProVisionaire kiosk controller so that I can test it and see what it will look like on the final product. So I click the run button and it will open up a version of ProVisionaire Control kiosk. This is just a temporary controller just so we can have a look at it and test it. I can grab the fader, move it up and down, and I can see that it is controlling the CL1. So, all good so far. I mentioned earlier that there are 3 different ways to put on controllers for parameters onto the screen in the work area. We can go to the widgets, we can drag in a widget, but that has no parameter associated with it, so I'll delete that. The better way is to go to the devices and then choose the exact parameter you want to control and drag that into the window. However, if you're programming for MRX7D, there's the 3rd way of doing it. Those of you who've used ProVisionaire Touch on the iPad to create a controller for MRX7D will know that you have to send the iPad an RCSL file or a list of parameters that you want to control. Now with ProVisionaire Control, there's no need to do that. You can go into MRX Designer, you can find the parameter you want to control and drag and drop that into the work area, saving you lots of time. So let's do that now. Normally I'd use 2 screens to do this, but today we're just using the one PC, so I've minimized ProVisionaire Control slightly and I'll drag it to one side. Underneath is our MTX MRX editor software. Open up the MRX Designer and you can see I've made a very simple design here. Double click on the faders, and it's this fader for channel 1 that I want to control using ProVisionaire Controller. So, with ProVisionaire Control open, I click on the fader and I drop it into the window. Here we can see then that this fader is controlling the fader level for channel 1 on MRX7D. If you remember in the introduction, I talked about the difference between iPad version and ProVisionaire Control kiosk version for Windows. They can control different parameters on different devices. There's a slight difference between the 2 models. And if you're programming in ProVisionaire Control and you've started in one particular mode, iPad or Windows, you can be reassured that you cannot choose parameters that are unable to be controlled in that particular mode. So if you're in iPad mode, you might be able to control certain parameters that you cannot control in Windows, but you'll never be able to put one on by mistake onto the screen. Now looking at the widgets and device parameters in a little bit more depth. In the widgets so far we've looked at faders, but you can see on the list here we've got recall buttons, we've got on-off buttons, transport control, meters, shapes and images, which I'll cover later on. Shapes can be dragged and dropped into the screen, and they can represent buttons which can have parameters associated with them. Alternatively, let's look at the device CL1 again, and let's drag an on-off button into the screen. It's asking which channel it wants to be associated with, so I'll just choose one channel at this point. And we can then go on to design the properties of that particular button. Let me show you how you can change the properties or the look of this one particular button. Then, if you like that particular style of button that you've created, as with any of the faders or any other part of your design, you can create a master style for that particular widget. And to do that, we go up here onto the screen and save that as a master style. Then whenever you drop one of those particular widgets onto the screen or a parameter from a device, it will copy the style of that master style that you've saved. Any of the labels you create can be rotated by 90 degrees, so you could build up a design in portrait mode rather than landscape mode for your tablet. And once your design is starting to get filled with different parameters, it's also easy to identify them by rolling over any of the widgets on the screen that will show the parameter and the device associated with it. At the end of the day, as you're building your controller, you must think of the customer. The customer must be able to simply see or visualize what it is that he or she is controlling. Let me open up a file that I've worked on before so you can see how images make it more easy for the customer to understand what they're controlling. Here you see a file called PVC Demo or ProVisionaire Control Demo. So I'll double click on that. Now it's asking me to enter a code if I've set one up. Security levels for all parts of ProVisionaire Control can be put in by the programmer, so users can only access certain areas that you allow them to. I've not used a security code here, so I'll just click OK. And here we have a design that I've created. I'm no graphic designer, so I'm not going to win any prizes for this, but I've tried to include some graphic elements to make it more interesting or more fun and more understandable for the end user to work with. The mixing console image I took from a screen grab from a PM10 brochure and then popped it into Photoshop. I then reformatted it and I saved it to the same scale as I'm going to use on my tablet. This is quite important because it's very nice to use high resolution graphics, but the larger the file size potentially could start to slow down the processing on your remote control. So try to keep the size of the graphics as small as possible or as scaled to the tablet you're going to use as possible. Once I'd finished with the picture in Photoshop, I then inserted it as an image in the background on ProVisionaire Control and then placed the widgets or faders on top of it to make it look like a real mixer. At the top of each fader, you can see a label. These are actually channel names. They take a direct link from the product you're controlling and they insert the name when the controller is running. And it will change in real time. So if, for example, I change the name of a channel on CL1, it'll automatically update onto my ProVisionaire controller. We'll have a look at that later on. What are the other buttons doing here? Well, here's a mic on button, and this actually controls a mute group master on the CL1. So if we're thinking about this as a conference room controller, this can turn on and off all of the different mics. If I click on it, I can then see the different images I've used for the on status and the off status. For the on image, I chose the microphone mesh without any coloring. And then for the off image, I chose the microphone mesh with a slight bit of red coloring, so it's easier for the customer to see when it's on or when it's off. I was also able to change the label to show mics on or mics off and give them a different color. On the right hand side, we can see two more buttons saying 1 and 1+2. What these are actually doing is changing presets on the MRX7, which are recalling a different set of room combinations. So I'm emulating the changing of a hotel banquet hall, for example, and combining not just the one room, but then one room and another room. And then on the top right hand side is another button which says amp room. This is actually a page change button. It takes me to another page. In this case, I've called amp control room. Here we see an image of a bank of amplifiers and a simple switch that says on. Now the on image has the switch in the on position and the off image has the switch in the off position. And it also darkens the room. It's a fun and visual way of a customer seeing what's changing. And the parameter that that's controlling is actually standby mode on the XMV amplifier behind me. Now, of course, we might need to go back to the mixer page, so I had to put another page jump button here, which takes me back to the home page or mixer page. Let's press run and see how that works in action. We open up ProVisionaire Control Kiosk, and we get a virtual and working model of our ProVisionaire Control design. We can then go on and test all of the parameters. So if I move this fader here, you'll see it's moving the channel 1 fader on CL1, and you can see that it says here mic 1, and it has picked up the mic 1 label from the channel name on the CL1. If I go over to the CL1, channel 4 is currently labeled Bob, just because we're trying to be funny. If I, in real time, change the name of that channel, you'll see it automatically updates the ProVisionaire kiosk file, so that if you have an engineer working on the CL and adjusting things, it will be reflected in my ProVisionaire Control kiosk file. I mentioned before that the Mics On button is actually controlling the mute groups for the first 4 channels. So if I click that, you'll see it changes colour to Mics Off, and you can see the channels 1 to 4 are now in mute mode. Over here, if I click on these, you'll see the scene changes on the MRX7 changing as I click them. And then if I hit this page jump button with amp room written on it, it will take me to another page. Here, if I click on the switch, it switches the amplifiers into standby, just as we'd hoped. And then back to the mixer page to return to my mixing duties. And these faders over here are actually controlling the stereo inputs for different sound sources such as background music or for PC playback, etc. And on the right hand side here, I have my master stereo. Up until now, we've been talking about ProVisionaire Control running on a Windows tablet, and we've seen how we can demonstrate the run function, and we've seen it operating. Let's talk a little bit about the iPad version. I'm going to open up a new file, and this time, once I've chosen my network controller, I'm going to choose ProVisionaire Touch Kiosk iOS, and it will automatically default to the aspect ratio, and I choose the screen size I want. I will add in the same devices as I used with the previous design, just so we can see them all there. And just for a demonstration, I'm going to choose a background image, one of which I chose and used earlier on in a previous design. So we'll run that image there, and I've got it in aspect fit, and I'll change that to full, so it fills up the 4:3 aspect ratio screen. Now I want to demonstrate how you do the run controller using the iPad. If we click the run button up here, you'll see it's saying to connect to the iPad it needs to be on the same Wi-Fi channel, which this is. But I first of all have to open up ProVisionaire Kiosk on my iPad, and you can see there's nothing on the screen there. Now if I refresh the button there, it now identifies my iPad as being available to send to it. I then will click the run button on my screen, and you will see it says someone's trying to send you a file, do you accept it? I press the accept button, and now it's instantly transmitted the file that I had on my ProVisionaire Control to my iPad. If I had parameters there, I could test them and do exactly as I could with the Windows controller version. Now we've seen demonstration of the iPad in run mode, let me add a few more hints and tips that might help you program. If I take 6 faders, for example, and drag them onto my screen, there they are, you can see that they're not really in the right configuration that I want them to be. So it's quite fiddly, quite difficult trying to move them into position. It can take a bit of time. But if I get them all roughly in the same position, then there is, and select them all, then there are 2 buttons at the top, one of which is distribute horizontally, so it evens out the distances between the faders, and then distribute vertically, and then it lines them all up in the straight line. Great for helping you do quick designs on the screen. Another little tip I want to mention to you is, if I was to go to the widgets and I was to insert an image by dragging it onto the screen there, I've got a PNG of that on switch which we saw earlier on. If I choose that, and then I make sure that the aspect ratio is locked so it always expands in the same scale, as I make it larger, you can see that there's still a kind of green background around the edges, and that's the on color. If I click on color, which is currently set to green, it's this parameter here, alpha channel, that I want you to be aware of. This can increase the transparency of colors in your design. So if I take it from 255 to 0 and then click OK, you'll see that that green background has now become transparent, and you can do that with a lot of other graphics. Hopefully that'll make your life a lot easier. As you can see, there's lots of parameters you can play around with, many different ways to design a controller. Once you've finished your design and you're happy with it, then you want to go to the button at the top there which says Export. This is the kiosk file that you're going to send to your customer to use on their chosen tablet. If I click the Export button there, we have the choice of sending it to your computer, which you can then email or transfer to your customer in whichever way you want. Or we can click on to ProVisionaire Touch Kiosk for iPad. And you can see there again, it's identified my iPad there. So I select that, I hit transfer, and once again, it's asking me whether I want to accept the file to be transferred to my iPad. ProVisionaire Control is a really useful way of giving your customer simple control, whether it's for a hospitality venue such as a hotel or a restaurant, or if it's a conference center where you can control things like mixers and amplifiers and speakers. The best way to learn it is to use it, so download it and enjoy.
That's brilliant, Carl. Thank you so much for that training
You're
session.
welcome. There's a lot to take on board.
Yeah, but I mean, it's amazing, isn't it? Because some conference systems and so on are so complicated with sophisticated devices like the CL or QL mixer, MRX devices, amplifiers all networked in many different locations. Yet you can give the customer a little app with just the essential functions, so non-professional sound engineers can operate.
Yes, so
an amazing
for
system.
example, an MC in a conference center, he might have simple control. But what I love about it is if you've got a mixing engineer on a CL or a QL, they can be making adjustments live, and it will update it live on your controller. So you always know what each other's doing, which is very, very useful.
And you can customize it with corporate logos or photos of the venues or the specific
any sort of design. You don't have to go down my route. There's some very clever and very sophisticated looking designs that have been made on ProVisionaire Control and Touch. Have you got any?
Some questions have come in, Carl.
Questions.
Yeah. So the first question that came in quite a bit earlier, actually, which perhaps was partly answered by your training, was which amplifiers can we access and control?
Okay, so you can control the XMV range, the Nexo NX amplifiers, as well as the new PCD DI amplifiers. And you'll have seen in that video some other control functions where things like power saving functions, so I can put these into standby remotely from my controller. And so at the end of the night in a museum or a church or whatever, you just hit the standby button and everything shuts down and saves you money.
Brilliant. Now, another question related to the pictures or photos that you transferred onto the app. What image formats can we work with?
Image formats can be BMP, PNG with the transparent backgrounds, and JPEGs. But on the subject of images, I do want to point something out which I may have forgotten to put in the video, and that is, if you're using images, of course, try to keep them as a sensible size, as I mentioned. Too bigger images can slow down the operating speed. But more importantly is try not to or don't overlap images on top of each other. Even if you've got a small image, sometimes it has a white background.
Right.
So get it as tight as you can. Don't overlap them, because if you overlap them, the image on top will block the image below, so you won't be able to get any control of the parameter you're trying to do that.
And if you're using the picture as a button, then you could activate the wrong process.
Yeah, or you might have another button underneath it. So be very conscious of what you're putting onto the screen, so you don't hide things behind each other.
Right. Okay.
That's my tip on images.
Yeah, like it. So let's just confirm again which operating systems the software works with.
ProVisionaire Control, you mean?
Yeah.
So in terms of the ProVisionaire Control editing software, that'll work on Windows 7, 8.1 and 10. But in a minute, I'm going to show you some of the new features of ProVisionaire Control 3.5.
Oh,
And that includes a monitoring function, which
right.
monitors CL and RIOs, etc. But the monitoring function will only work on Windows 10, and which is what most PCs are running.
Yeah, it's been around a few years now, hasn't
I
it?
got rid of my XP a long time ago, thank goodness. So, shall I run and have a quick look at the...
One more question,
Okay.
if that's all right.
Yeah.
We mentioned video switchers
Oh, yes.
earlier. Let's confirm which type of video switchers.
The video switches
included.
are a third-party company. They're Japanese-made, and it's a company called IDK. And I actually cover that in a little bit in the version 3.5
Oh, do you?
update.
Well, let's learn about version 3.5 then.
Yeah, so if we can go over to input 4, let's have a look at some of the new features that we've got on version 3.5. As I just said, there's a new advanced monitoring facility for CL, QL, and Rio D2 I/O racks, as well as the PCD DI amplifiers. You've got control of more Yamaha devices, plus those IDK video switches.
Great.
And you have new widgets, including a multi-function button, which was previously on ProVisionaire Touch. The multi-function button allows you to do more than one parameter at a time by pressing just one single button. So I could turn on one channel whilst turning many other different channels off. And that can operate up to 16 different parameters at the same time. Let's look a little bit more detail as to the monitoring functions. So here we've got some examples of the pages here where we can see CL5 and the Rio D2s, IP addresses, firmware versions, and a fault check, if you like, fault report. We've got more detailed functionality of the CLs in this case, and the Dante cards and the MAC addresses, etc. The same thing there for the Rio D2s. And we can even see things such as devices' internal temperature, environmental temperature, and Dante clock frequency offset. So
Well, that's huge amounts of information.
lots of data, but you will need Windows 10 to run that using
Right.
ProVisionaire Control. And then lastly, on terms of version 3.5, as I mentioned, this will now for the first time be able to control third-party products, in this case, the IDK video switches. And there are there's a large number of those in this range. A digital multi-switcher here, which also includes 64 channels of Dante. So it will incorporate very nicely into a sort of conference center type of design.
Yeah.
For ProVisionaire Control.
Yeah, great for switching between multi-channel sources.
Yeah, precisely. Yeah. Are there any more questions coming? I'm looking at the time. We're starting to run a little bit short on time. I'm just wondering whether anybody else has got some questions.
I think we're just about ready to wrap up.
Brilliant.
But let's inform everyone about the next webinar that we'll be planning in October.
Okay.
So, in October, yes, we'll be back, and we have a House of Worship special focusing on the Rivage consoles, so PM7 and PM10 mixing systems. I recently had a chance to visit a couple of customers in the USA, and I've been able to train House of Worship engineers in probably 5 or 6 continents around the world. So I've been able to gather a lot of tips and tricks from the professionals. We shall let you know some of the unique benefits that the Rivage systems give you for volunteer operators. And we will give you some idea how to elevate your sound and enhance your workflow.
Great, and that'll be sometime in October.
Indeed, yes.
Right, so it's a case of watch this space to see when that interesting webinar will be hosted by Andy. In the meantime, don't forget, ProVisionaire Control and ProVisionaire Touch is free.
It really is free, yes?
It is free, yep. You don't have to pay a single dime.
Download from yamaha.com/pro audio.
Yep.
And if you want to watch us again or tell your friends and colleagues, find us on YouTube, Yamaha Global channel, or look for #Audioversity.
In the meantime, enjoy the rest of your day and look forward to seeing you soon.
See you soon.